everyone. Welcome to your first video in this series. Now recall in the introductory video I said that programming is basically giving instructions for a computer to follow. Well, how do you talk to the computer? How do you give it instructions? There are several ways. One easy way to do it is to install this program called Python, and then you basically send these text commands to Python, and Python will then instruct the computer to do what you asked it to do. So first of all, let's go ahead and download this Python. Open up your browser and then just Google Python. Click the first link, move your mouse over this downloads button and just click this. That will install an installer for you. Go ahead, run that installer. All the default options are fine. And once it's finished installing, you should have a program called idle, I-D-L-E. Launch that program. And this is basically the window that should come up when you launch that program. So again, you can think of this window as your window to telling the computer what to do. So the most basic thing that we can tell a computer to do is to store some information. We store information in variables. So let me go ahead and store in a variable called A. I want to store some information, 3. So here what I've basically told the computer is I want to store the value 3 and I want to call it A. Now we say A is a variable and we say this 3 is a value, and this value has a type. Since 3 is an integer, the type of this value is integer. Give you a second example. I want the variable B to refer to the value 4.4. So here I'm telling the computer, hey, store some information, the value 4.4, which is of type decimal, or in Python this is called a float. So float and decimal are the same thing, but in Python they just call it a float. And then so here we have an integer that we stored in the computer. Here we have a float that we stored in the computer. Well, we can also store strings, and strings are useful because a lot of times we want to store them inside the computer for things like word processing, text editors, stuff like that. So we're telling the computer to store the string hello, and we're going to call that data C. So you can think of variables as just a name to refer to some data that you have stored into the computer. That data is called a value, and it also has a type. Now why does it have a type? Well, the concept of type is basically because different types of data have different operations that are valid for it. Now that's just a complex way of saying that you can't do, let's say there's a certain operation called divide, right? That's an operation. Well, you can't divide everything by everything. This divide operation only works on certain types. Sure, it works on integers and sure it works on floats. But does dividing a string by another string make sense? No. So that's why we have the concept of types, because a type basically tells you what operations are valid on all the values of that type. Let's go ahead and confirm that all of these variables have been stored inside the computer. So in idle, if you just type in the name of the variable and then press enter, idle will go look at the value and spit that back out right at you so that you can view it. So A has the value 3, which is of type int, remember? We can go ahead and see if B is stored, and it's stored as 4.4, which is a float. And let's see C. Yep, C is stored, and it's a string hello. So now we've learned how to store information into the computer and how to retrieve that information. Now let's go ahead and do some basic operations on that stuff, because this is where all the cool things happen. When you start manipulating this stored information, you get cool programs like Microsoft Word where you're manipulating the text. You're adding, deleting text based on whether the user types in stuff or presses backspace. Or even video games where you're constantly manipulating a lot of numbers and pictures. So we've stored some data into the computer and now we want to manipulate it. This is where operations come in. So we do operations on the data. Now for the types integer and float, the typical operations of addition, multiplication, division are defined. So we'll go ahead and use it. We'll instruct the computer to do those operations on our data. So let's go ahead and say we want to take the value 3, we want to add the value 4 to it, and we want to store that in a new variable. We'll call it D, I guess. So since this is something a little new, slightly different than what we did above, I may as well spend some time to explain it. Here we just assigned up here, if I can get your attention up here, we just basically assigned the value 3 to the variable A, right? So we're saying A refers to just the value 3. But here what we're saying the computer to do, what we're telling the computer to do, is we're telling the computer to take the value 3, add that to the value 4. So in other words, apply the addition operation on the values 3 and 4. And then assign the results of that operation to the variable D. Now I know that the way that I'm saying this is like super precise. Why can't I just say D equals 3 plus 4? Well, because these little terms that I'm using, they're really easy to explain with these easy examples, but they're going to apply constantly when you do way more complex things. That's why I'm being very picky with my language here. Anyways, let's run that and let's see if the computer properly stored the real value. So if we query what D is, or if we find out what D is, and it's 7. Perfect. And just for practice and just to really sink this in, let's create a new variable called E, and we're gonna make it do 10.0 divided by 2.0. And let's look at the results, is 5.0, which is what we expect. Now we cannot do the division operation on strings because it makes no sense, but the addition operation is defined for strings because it kind of makes sense. You can think of adding two strings as simply joining them together into one longer string. So I'll show you an example. We'll call this one F. So to the variable F we will assign high plus there. So we're telling the computer here in this line to apply the addition operation on the strings high and there, and then take the result of that addition operation and assign the whole thing to the variable F. Again, I know I'm sorry for being so precise with my language, but if you drill that in your head, everything else will be super easy. So that's it. Now let's see the value of F, which is high there. Now you notice that there isn't a space between high and there. Well, that's because we didn't put a space anywhere here. If you actually wanted the space, you could have added a space after high manually, and then it would appear there. So basically, we've learned that we can store variables inside the computer. Variables are just names that refer to the data. The data we call values, and those values have a type. And we can manipulate that data by doing certain operations on them. The operations that you can do on certain data depends on the type of those data. We've shown you the simple operations of addition and division, but there's also multiplication and of course subtraction. But there is a different way to basically do operations on types, because there's more than just addition and subtraction and stuff like that you can do. And this is how you do it through Python. So for example, there is an operation called basically capitalize that you can only do on strings. And here's how you tell the computer to do that operation. It's a little different because there's no symbol that we use for capitalization. So this is how you invoke this operation. So F is a string, as obvious through this line right here. So we're going to do F, and then you're going to do dot. So you're saying I want to invoke some operation on the variable F, which has a value of type string, right? So when you press dot, then idly will show you a list of the operations that you can do on that type. We're going to go ahead and pick the very top one, capitalize, and you can just hit tab and it should select that, or enter. Okay, so F dot capitalize, and that will basically return to us a new string, and we're going to assign that to another variable. We're going to call it G. And let's see what that does. So let's slow down and walk through this line. What are we telling the computer to do? We're telling the computer we're basically telling the computer to invoke an operation on the variable F, right? Since the variable F points to a value that has a type string, we can invoke this capitalize operation on this variable. So what that will do is basically capitalize the first letter of that value. So let's see what the results are. Let's print it out. And basically, there we go, see capital H here. So we saw two ways of applying operations, right? One way is by using a symbol and then surrounding the symbol with the data that you want to operate on. And another way is by basically putting the variable name on the left and then a dot and then the operation name on the right. This is, just a syntax. It's not a big deal. You don't have to memorize it or anything, but just know that there's a few different ways that we can tell the computer to do an operation on some data. And I'll show you yet a third way. And the reason why I'm showing you all three of these ways right now is because we're going to be using them in the subsequent tutorials, so I just want to get you used to it. So there is an operation called len, and this operation can tell you the number of characters in a string. So we have the string, F here, which refers to hi there. And it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 characters, right? So if we pass that string into this operation, let's see what we get. And we'll assign that to H. Okay, so again, I want to slow down, and I know I'm risking boring you guys, but let's walk through this statement right over here, okay? What are we telling the computer to do? We're telling the computer to basically apply the len operation on the variable f. So remember that operations operate on data. Variables are a way to refer to data that we have already stored in the computer, right? So I hope that made sense. So if refers to some data, and that data is of type string, and it's right over here, we want to apply the len operation. Now what does the len operation do? This is where you basically ask a coworker or you quickly look at the documentation, which I'll show you later on. But I already know what it does. The len operation counts the number of characters in a string. It does more than that, and I know people are going to call me out on that, but for the purposes of this tutorial, you can think of it as that, and it's absolutely fine. Okay, so let's see what our results are. 7. So that makes sense because there's 7 characters inside this F string. Okay, I think I'm going to wrap it up for this first video because it seems like I've written enough code to go off of this one page over here, and I don't want to do that right now. So let's do a quick recap, a quick summary. I know I used a lot of jargon, a lot of terminology, and I hope this summary will clarify and kind of make them all very cohesive for you. So we said that the purpose of a program is really to tell the computer what to do, right? And the most basic thing you can tell a computer is to store some data. You're going to say, hey computer, I want you to store this number 3 that I'm going to call A, because later on I want to refer to that number 3, so when I want to refer to it I will call it A, right? That's why you name what you store. And then we can do operations on that stored data. And there's a couple of different ways that we can do operations. I guess most intuitive is the operations of addition, subtraction, and things like that, because there's a symbol for them. So this is the syntax for how we invoke operations that just have a symbol. But certain operations don't have symbols, they just have names. Like for example, we have the capitalize operation. And the way that you call the capitalize operation is by putting the object or putting the variable on the left and then a dot in between them. So this is just how you invoke it. There's another operation, another type of operations where you just basically name the operation and then put in your data or your variable between parentheses that follow the operation. So in quick summary, you put in data, I guess a summary of the summary, you put in data into the computer, you name that data, we call that variables, and then you operate on those data. And there's several different ways you can invoke those operations, and I showed you the syntax for one way here, when there's a symbol that represents the operation. But when there isn't a symbol that represents the operation, then here's another way that you can invoke the operation, and here's yet a third way that you can invoke the operation. This is all preliminary stuff. I hope you get the big picture here. We're putting some data into the computer, and then we're manipulating that data. I hope to see you in the second tutorial. Bye-bye.